equality of states. The quintessential nature of the complex of superiority or exceptionalism was the lordly statement of the head of the European Union head, Joseph Borrell, stating that Europe is a heavenly garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I would also quote the joint declaration of NATO-EU dating 10 January 2023, which states, I quote, "The United West will leverage all economic, financial, political, and, I would note this in particular, military instruments at the disposal of NATO and the EU for the advancement of the interests of our common billion." That is what the declaration states. The collective West has arrogantly reshaped for tailored processes of multilateralism at the regional level for the advancement of their interests. Just recently, the United States called for the Monroe Doctrine to be revived, demanding that Latin American countries limit ties with the Russian Federation and People's Republic of China. This policy, however, came up against the decisive focus of countries in the region to strengthen their own multilateral structures, first and foremost, CELAC, and to uphold their legitimate right to stand as a pillar of the multilateral world order. The Russian Federation fully supports these justified aspirations. Now, there have been significant forces in the United States and allies to undermine multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. And this cooperation around economy and security has for decades been unfolding around ASEAN. This system allowed for consensual approaches to be established, which were beneficial to the 10 members, the dozen members of ASEAN and their partners in dialogue, including Russia, China, the U.S., India, Japan, Australia, Republic of Korea, which provided for genuine inclusive multilateralism. By advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy, Washington has embraced a policy of destroying this established architecture. And during the last NATO summit in Madrid, there was an assertion of all peace lovers and about the exclusively peaceful nature of their military programs, announcing global responsibility and divisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the so-called Indo-Pacific region. So now, the policy of NATO, as of course a defensive organization, is now moved to western shores of the Pacific Ocean. The bloc-based approaches undermine the Asia-centric mindsets, and they are manifest in the creation of a military alliance, AUKUS, which has now embraced Tokyo, Seoul, and a number of ASEAN countries under the aegis of the U.S. Mechanisms for intervention in maritime security issues have been established to uphold the unilateral interests of the West. Mr. Borrell, who I mentioned, promised yesterday to send EU military naval forces to that region. It is not concealed that the goal of the Indo-Pacific strategy is to deter China and to isolate Russia, and this is how Western colleagues view effective multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. After the collapse of the Warsaw Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union departing from the stage, a hope was fermented for the advancement of the principles of genuine inclusive multilateralism in the Euro-Atlantic space. But instead of tapping into the potential of the OSCE on equitable, collective basis, Western countries not only preserve NATO, but contrary to their pledges, they moved towards arrogantly absorbing spaces, including those territories where vital interests of the Russian Federation existed and will always continue to exist. As was reported by the then U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker to President George Bush the Elder, the main threat for NATO is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I would add that presently the United Nations and what is enshrined in its charter also represent a threat to Washington's global ambitions. Russia has painstakingly attempted to reach mutually beneficial multilateral agreements with an emphasis on the principle of indivisibility of security, which was proclaimed and enshrined in outcome documents of the OSCE summits of both 1999 and 2010. There, it states explicitly, categorically, black and white, that nobody is to strengthen one's own security at the expense of the security of others. And no state, group of states, or organization can be vested with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace in the OSCE region, or consider any region of the OSCE whatsoever as a part of its sphere of influence. NATO trampled upon these obligations, and the presidents and premiers of its member states, and did the opposite, proclaiming its right to any arbitrary action. An egregious example is the unlawful bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, including with depleted uranium being used, which resulted in an uptick in cancer cases, both for Serb citizens and NATO military personnel. Joe Biden was then a senator, and he, not without pride, he said before the cameras that he personally called for the bombing of Belgrade and the destruction of all bridges on the Dnieper River. And now, the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, Mr. Hill, through media outlets, has called on the Serbs to turn the page and to stop getting upset. About stopping getting upset, the U.S. has gained a great deal of experience. Japan has been shamefully quiet about who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As we know, during the G7 summit, Mr. Blinken, with great pathos, lamented the suffering of victims of the bombing, but he did not manage to mention the culpability of the United States. These are the rules. And after the Second World War, these are criminal misadventures of Washington which were set into play. The shameful invasion by the U.S.-led coalition into Iraq in 2003 was an egregious violation of the United Nations Charter, as was the aggression against Libya in 2011. The result was the destruction of statehood, hundreds of thousands of dead, rampant terrorism. A blatant violation of the UN Charter also was a U.S. intervention in post-Soviet states' affairs. Color revolutions were organized in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. There was a brutal coup in Kiev in 2014, and this also includes attempts to forcibly seize power in Belarus in 2020. The Anglo-Saxons, the West, not only justify or attempt to justify these criminal misadventures, but they also taunt their policy of advancement of democracy. And the same has to do with the rules. Kosovo, they'll recognize independence without the referendum. The Crimea, they won't recognize it despite the fact that there was a referendum. Falklands and Malvinas, they will not be touched, for there was the cleverly referendum there. This is laughable. In order to abandon double standards, we call for all to adhere to consensual agreements which were agreed upon through the 1970 UN Declaration on the Principles of International Law. It explicitly proclaims the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who, I quote, respect the principle of equality and self-determination of peoples, and which have governments which represent all the people residing on that territory. Any objective observer can clearly see that the Nazi Kiev regime can in no way be regarded as representing the residents of the territory who refused to accept the results of the brutal coup in February 2014. And as a result of this, the putschists unleashed war against them similarly. Pristina cannot claim to represent the interests of Kosovar Serbs, who were promised autonomy by the European Union, just like Berlin and Paris promised special status for Donbass. The results of these promises are well known. Our Secretary General stated this eloquently during the Second Summit for Democracy on 29 March. And I quote, "Democracy emanates from the Charter of the United Nations," and its first words, "we the peoples," reflects the fundamental source of legitimate power, the consent of the governed. The consent, I emphasize this. In order to halt the war that was unleashed in the east of Ukraine, multilateral efforts were undertaken for the advancement of a peaceful settlement. These were enshrined in Security Council resolution, which unanimously approved the Minsk agreements. These Minsk agreements were trampled upon by Kiev and its Western handlers, who themselves recently cynically and even with pride recognized that they never intended to implement this. They simply wanted to gain time to funnel weapons into Ukraine against Russia. In this way, there was a public proclamation of a violation of multilateralism, a multilateral obligation of all members of the United Nations, which is enshrined in the Charter, which requires that all members comply with the resolutions of the Security Council. Our subsequent action to prevent confrontation, including President Putin's proposal dating December 2021 for the agreement to be reached on multilateral mutual security guarantees, were high-handedly rejected. Nobody, we were told, can prevent NATO from embracing Ukraine. For all of the years after the coup, despite our insistence, none of Kiev's handlers brought Poroshenko or Zelensky or the Ukrainian Upper Rada to their senses. Nobody brought them to their senses. In the Upper Ukrainian Rada, through legislation, the Russian language, Russian education, Russian media outlets, and Russian culture, religious traditions were destroyed in a direct violation of the Ukrainian Constitution and the Universal Convention on the Rights of National Minorities. In parallel, the Kiev regime, through legislation and day-to-day life, introduced Nazi practice and theory without any concealment. Openly, they organized in the center of Kiev and other cities exuberant torch-bearing marches with SS division banners upheld. The West remained silent, and this was fully in line with U.S. plans to leverage the openly racist regime in the hope of weakening the Russian Federation in a strategic focus on eliminating competitors. It is clear to all, even though not everybody talks about this, is not at all about Ukraine. It's about how international relations will continue to be shaped through the establishment of a sound consensus on the basis of balance of interests, or through aggressive and volatile advancement of Washington's hegemony. We cannot consider the Ukrainian issue separately from the geopolitical context. Multilateralism provides for respect for the United Nations Charter and all of its interlinkage of its principles, and this was mentioned above. The Russian Federation has clearly announced the goals which we are pursuing through the special military operation to eradicate the threats to our security, which were created for years by NATO representatives directly on our borders, and to protect people who have been deprived of the rights proclaimed through multilateral conventions, to protect them from the public statements of a Kiev regime and their actions and direct threats to destroy and expel them from territories where their predecessors lived for centuries. What were the U.S. doing in NATO doing in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya? Were there threats there to their security, their culture, their religions, their languages? What were the multilateral norms that they guided them in their proclamations of the independence of Kosovo and the violation of the principles of the OSCE through the destruction of the stable economically stable states of Iraq and Libya, which collapsed as a result of their actions, and those places were located thousands of miles from U.S. shores. The multilateral system was a blatant attempt of the U.S., and there's a clear imbalance in the UN Secretariat and the UN as a whole, and this is now seen in the staff who are now taking liberties with politically motivated conduct that is not befitting of international civil servants. We urge the Secretary General to ensure that all of his staff comply with impartiality in line with Article 100 of the UN Charter. We also urge the Secretariat leadership in drafting documents on the common agenda, which was mentioned here, the new agenda for peace, which is mentioned here, to be guided by the need to suggest to member states ways to find a balance of interests rather than helping to advance neoliberal concepts. Otherwise, instead of a multilateral agenda, there will be a deepening of a division between the golden billion and the international majority. Speaking of multilateralism, we cannot be limited to the international context as a whole. Just when we talk about democracy, the international context cannot be disregarded. Double standards need to be abandoned, and multilateralism and democracy need to be respected within states and in their relations one another. Everybody knows that the West, in imposing their understanding of democracy on others, does not want to see democratization of international relations on the basis of respect for sovereign equality of states. But now, advancing their rules on the international arena, they're increasingly asphyxiating multilateralism and democracy at home, applying increasingly repressive tools for suppressing any dissent, as their criminal Kyiv regime has done with the support of its teachers, the U.S. and allies. Distinguished colleagues, as was the case in the Cold War, we have reached a dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold. The situation is worsened with the loss of trust in multilateralism, when the financial economic aggression of the West is destroying the benefits of globalization, when the United States and its allies are abandoning diplomacy and demanding clarification of relations on the battlefield. And this is all done in the halls of the United Nations, which was created to prevent the horrors of war. The voices of wisdom are undermined, and they're calling for the revival of culture of dialogue, and they are muzzled by those who have decided to undermine the core principles of multilateral relations. We all need to return to the source, respect for the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and all the diversity and interlinkages. Genuine multilateralism on the international stage at present necessitates adaptation of the United Nations to reflect the trends of the establishment of multilateral architecture of international relations. There's a need to expedite reform of the Security Council to enhance representation of Asian, African, Latin American countries. The current excessive, overwhelming representation of the West in this body undermines the principle of multilateralism. As well as initiative, the Group of Friends in Protection of the UN Charter was established. We urge all states respecting the Charter to join this. There's an important need for to tap in the potential of BRICS, SCO, Eurosec, CIS, STO, and of course, we are in favor of actively leveraging the initiative and position of regional associations of countries of the Global South. An important role in supporting multilateralism can be played by the G20 if Western participants stop diverting the attention of colleagues from pressing matters on its agenda in their attempt to conceal their own culpability for the accumulation of crises in the global economy. Our common obligation is to preserve the United Nations as the tried and tested beacon for multilateralism and coordination of international policies and politics. The key to success is concerted efforts, abandonment of claims for any exceptionalism, and I repeat this once again, respect for sovereign equality of states. This is what we all signed on to when we ratified the Charter of the United Nations. In 2021, President Putin proposed the establishment of a summit. The summit to convene for permanent members of the Security Council. The leaders of China and France supported this initiative. However, unfortunately, this was not realized. This is directly related to multilateralism, not because the 5 permanent members have certain privileges as compared to the others, but specifically due to their particular responsibility under the Charter of the United Nations for the maintenance of international peace and security. And this is specifically what is required now under the imperatives of the UN-centric system, which as a result of the actions of the West is evaporating before very eyes. Concerns about the situation are increasingly prevalent in the multilateral initiatives and ideas of global South countries, from the East and from Southeast Asia, from the Arab Muslim world as a general, and Africa, Latin America. We value their intention to focus on concerted efforts for the maintenance of a balance of interest on the basis of the sovereign equality of states and indivisibility of security. And to conclude, I wish to turn to all journalists who are now covering today's meeting. Your colleagues from Russian media outlets were not allowed access here. The United States embassy in Moscow mockingly announced willingness to issue visas when our plane took off. So I insist that you compensate for the loss of the presence of Russian journalists. Try to make your reporting objective so that the international community has a genuinely multilateral objective overview in your assessments and the facts provided. I now return to my duties as the President of the Security Council, and I give the floor to Mr. Khalifa Shaheen Al-Marar, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس أود بداية أن أشكركم.
Mr. President, I want to begin by thanking Foreign Minister Lavrov for presiding over this meeting. I also thank the Secretary General for his insightful briefing. Mr. President, our sustained commitment to effective multilateralism, grounded in international law and the principles of the UN Charter, is essential to maintaining international peace and security. In turn, defending the principles of the Charter is vital to maintaining effective multilateralism. These principles, including respect for the sovereignty of all nations, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, are fundamental to the ability of the United Nations to take effective action in accordance with the Charter. This is critical as the world is experiencing the highest number of armed conflicts since 1945. Forced displacement is at an all-time high. We are struggling to keep alive the 1.5-degree goal. Terrorism and extremism continue to evolve in a way that international efforts struggle to halt. To address our common challenges and threats, to resolve our differences through peaceful means, it is imperative to promote dialogue and cooperation among nations. We must double down on efforts to peacefully resolve conflicts and crises from the Sudan to Ukraine. The following three issues are critical for multilateralism to have a more positive impact to people's lives. First, multilateralism must serve the wider UN membership. The wider UN membership is a reflection of the rights and aspirations of 8 billion people and should remain front and center in our considerations. Yet, we have a multilateral system and mechanisms often struggling to act effectively due to polarization and competing interests. Some member states have always had a disproportionate influence over the multilateral system, including how these systems were set up and whether or not they function in the interest of all. It is these same member states that can prevent or realize the reforms necessary to make multilateralism more effective. Status quo structures will not move us beyond the status quo. From the Security Council to institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, multilateral mechanisms must be reformed to improve their legitimacy and representation. Decisions need to be made with vulnerable countries not only in mind, but at the table. For example, the emerging discussions on reforming international financial institutions to better deliver for the Global South offer an encouraging path to promote stability and improve equality worldwide. Second, protecting global common goods must be our top priority. Facilitating the peaceful settlement of disputes, promoting human security, and devising collective, albeit partial, solutions for the key threats facing humanity is the best investment we can make in our people and planet. We have seen constructive initiatives in the recent past, but this type of forward-looking cooperation should be the norm rather than the exception. The historic agreement for a new multilateral treaty on environmental conservation in the high seas and the Paris Agreement are specific examples of multilateral achievements that have propelled us forward. And finally, multilateralism cannot merely be an intergovernmental process. The perspectives of all stakeholders, including women as well as youth, must also help drive the conversation. During the pandemic, public-private partnerships in the UAE, from Dubai Ports World to the humanitarian city, supported multilateral efforts to ensure the global distribution of medical equipment and COVID vaccines. As the incoming president of COP28, we see the inclusion of all stakeholders, especially from vulnerable countries, as a cornerstone of success. The input of women, youth, indigenous groups, science, academia, and the private sector will be channeled across all outcomes. In conclusion, Mr. President, we stress that only by working together can we promote and deliver peace, stability, and prosperity for all nations and peoples. It is time to reform our multilateral system to ensure that we deliver on the aspirations of everyone around the world. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Al-Marrar for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ermani Mongo, Deputy Foreign Minister for Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to congratulate Russia on convening this important debate devoted to the ways in which we can make multilateralism more effective. I wish to thank the Secretary General for having provided such a lucid outline of the scope of our debate and the key issues at play. Our debate is occurring 1 week after the publication of the report of the Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. The recommendations issued by the illustrious panel appointed by the Secretary General reinforce our desire to reaffirm the very foundations of the harmonious coexistence of the international community, and we wish to do this to ensure greater international solidarity, which will serve as the bedrock of the security and dignity of current and future generations. This quest for international solidarity is the very raison d'etre for the United Nations Charter. By signing that charter, each member of the United Nations organization has chosen to back indivisible security. Acceding to the United Nations, each of the nations of the world has rejected the concept of divided nations, a hierarchy of nations, or nations which impose their agendas on others. This is a crystal clear choice enshrined in the preamble of the United Nations. We present ourselves as we the peoples of the world, as links of the same chain of humankind. It is this spirit which must not only remain at the heart of our collective security system, but it must also serve as the anchor for our vision of sustainable development and of shared prosperity. The ideal approach which will bring humankind towards its common destiny is the multilateral approach. Multilateralism is this inclusive dynamic of global governance based on the respect for and taking account of each nation's narrative. And that is because every nation matters, every people matters, and every life matters. Our differences in size, stature, and appearance are crucial additional components of our identity, which not only define us, but first and foremost are what justify our place and ensure our viability within the concert of nations. Our interdependence and the fact our destinies are inextricably linked are facts constantly brought before our eyes by pandemics, economic turbulence, global warming, and many more. Our primary threats now are more than ever transnational and cross-border in nature. Mr. President, to overcome future challenges, our security architecture must reflect current realities. We must update our international institutions, our mindsets, and our perceptions of lasting peace, shared prosperity, and peaceful coexistence. We must reinvent the solutions to modern threats, namely climate change and the chronic insecurity of fragile states. We must address the crisis of international solidarity. That crisis fuels the underlying economic, humanitarian, health, or food crisis. There is absolutely no way that we will be able to address the challenges of this century with the tools of the previous one. Mr. President, Africa is the second most densely populated continent on Earth. It is estimated that it will account for at least a quarter of the global population by 2050. It occupies almost 70% of the Security Council's agenda today. However, alas, it has no permanent seat on that decision-making body which holds Africa's security in its hands. Let us cease to make distressing observations and come now to issuing tangible proposals. 1. We must reform the Security Council without further ado to make it representative of today's realities and able to effectively respond to current and future challenges. Of course, as an African person, I hope that this reform will prioritize the common African position and the legitimate demands contained therein. These are reflected in the Esselwini Consensus and the CERT Declaration. It is patently clear that Africa will not wait forever for the vicissitudes of the intergovernmental reform process to pass. In the eyes of our people, that process is simply an interminable distraction. Here, I would recall the words of His Excellency Ali Bongo Mdiba, President of the Gabonese Republic, head of state, when he spoke at the General Assembly of the United Nations in September. He hammered home the fact that Africa will wait no longer. It is time for redress to be provided for this unacceptable injustice which works to Africa's detriment. We will at every turn submit to Africa's critical mass the ways in which we intend to act on this issue. 2. We must redefine our rules and our mechanisms so that we can adequately address the constantly changing security and terrorism landscapes. As regards rules, we must guarantee inclusivity and solidarity and vanquish once and for all the policy of double standards and two-track solidarity. We must also decisively tackle the root causes of conflict and crisis. 3. We must build a new social covenant, a new global compact between generations, between governors and the governed, and one which links action at a global and regional level. We must give particular emphasis to the status of young people and women. In this new social covenant for the future, bridges must replace walls everywhere. Education must vanquish the straitjacket of ignorance and intolerance. Multilateralism must prevail over unilateral postures. Dialogue must prevail over antagonism. It is a pipe dream to think that humankind will survive in bubbles of security and prosperity surrounded by an ocean of insecurity and poverty. If we were to labor under that misapprehension, the inevitable alternative to peace and prosperity for all would be collective decline and the jeopardy of all of our lives. We must, as a matter of priority, create a shield of actions and initiatives so that we can across the world vanquish the predatory pillaging of resources and all attacks against dignity. This will ensure that all peoples of the world will enjoy security, prosperity and greater freedom. Mr. President, I wish to underscore the need to cast aside any desire to defy or stray from multilateralism. Several monologues do not make a dialogue. Equally, a myriad of bilateral relations will never produce the effect or far less have the virtues of multilateral cooperation. Multilateralism leads to fragmentation. It divides the world into blocks. In contrast, the vocation of multilateralism is to build unity and bridges between we, the peoples of the world. We owe responses to current and future generations which are commensurate with their legitimate aspirations to live in security, peace, and in greater dignity. These responses are within our grasp. These responses cannot wait and must wait no longer. Thank you.
Благодарю.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Mongol for his statement, and I'll give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Thomas Mbomba, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellency, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, let me begin by congratulating you and the delegation of Russia for your presidency of the Security Council for the month of April. We also welcome the participation in this meeting of the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and thank him for his insightful remarks. As I make these remarks, let me also indicate that we associate ourselves with the statement that will be delivered later by the representative of the Republic of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. The multilateral system that was fashioned out of the ashes of the Second World War has no doubt been the cornerstone, with some exceptions, for relative peace, security, and development across the world. Adherence to the principles in the United Nations Charter, including the sovereign equality of states, and the prohibition of the use of force has been an underpinning pillar for the global stability. Disinformation, migration, crisis, food and energy insecurity, the world has never faced a more profound crisis since the World War or Cold War. Structural impairment, including the debilitating impact of the veto system in the Security Council, the chronic lack of financing for development, a rise in geopolitical competition, and a decline in international cooperation have helped our effort to renew global institutions and deepen multilateralism. In the face of an easy weakness to reject or undermine shared normative values and principles for collaboration and collective action, we risk relapsing into a New Hebrean state of nature. It is not too late to seek a way out of the increasingly confrontational politics, zero-sum games, and egoistic, chaotic, and brutish tendencies of recent years. It is in the interest of the states, whether small or mighty, to safeguard the multilateral system, since the agreed international rules and institutions allow all voices to be heard and the ability to influence the international order in less costly and more sustainable way. Ghana, therefore, welcomed the focus of today's debate, which provides us with an opportunity to deliberate on ways that we can defend the UN Charter and promote it towards an effective multilateral system. Mr. President, in considering how we can enhance an effectively rule-based multilateral system through the defense of the UN Charter, Ghana will share 5 main points. First, while it is important to reaffirm our respective commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, it is equally pertinent that we embark on practical steps to enhance our responsiveness to the demand of the UN, of the Charter. In this regard, we urge the prioritization of the enhanced, inclusive, and multi-stakeholder approach that enable all actors to adhere to the norms and values in the Charter. This, in our view, should be devoid of politicization as well as any form of selectivity in application. We cannot overemphasize the importance for member states to embrace a principled approach underpinned by a common understanding and good faith interpretation in the application of the provisions of the Charter. We must also prioritize the will of the people of the world if we are to achieve a smooth transition to a fair and equitable global world order. The cynicism which some countries display in the twisting principle or bending them to their will may bring short-term tendencies advantages. History shows those gains are ephemeral. Secondly, a candid recognition of the realities of our time should spur us all to embrace deliberate diplomatic actions to build mutual trust consistent with the diplomatic conventions. As my compatriot Kofi Annan once said, our futures, our prosperity and security are wrapped up together more than ever before. No country, no matter how wealthy or powerful, can any longer stand on its own. This reality should lead us to build bridges, not burn them, and lay solid foundations for dialogue and consensus, including using dialogue to objectively discuss the strategic intentions of countries, This remains critical for avoiding misjudgment and unhealthy competition, especially among majority of major military powers. Within this context, it is also important that we address the structural impairment in the multilateral system through a faithful and genuine effort in the ongoing reform initiative in the UN system, including the revitalization of the General Assembly and the reform of the Security Council. As an African member state, we have stated our position and justified our argument. Those who support a strengthened bilateral system have a responsibility to reciprocate and work constructively and urgently in good faith to address with us the historical injustice done the African continent, which is also one of the weaknesses in multilateral structure. Thirdly, the multilateral system should be turbocharged through an effective implementation of our objectives with regional arrangements that share similar objectives. We must therefore enhance implementation of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, especially around regional prevention. The United Nations has its strength, but when it is unable to act, the strength of regional actors must be embraced. For instance, we cannot attempt a legitimate resolution of the crisis of terrorism on the African continent without the collaboration of institutions of the African Union and the regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, as well as the Accra Initiative in the Sahel. It is also only fair that when such regional bodies stand up and offer to act, their burden should be shared with the principal body that owns that primary duty. Fourthly, prevailing global challenges are so interconnected and multidimensional that we need to enhance collaboration and joint consultation among different institutions and drive coherence to avoid negative and adverse consequences from global politics. This requires, we believe, enhancement of consultation with institutions and processes outside the UN system, such as Bretton Woods institutions, but also, as appropriate, with relevant civil society organizations and responsible private sector actors to adequately address pressing needs of the peoples of the world, especially those of the developing world. This is important because when there are global crises, such as the prevailing financial and food crisis, we should know that further down the road, there will be greater manifestation of socio-political instability, diminished capacity for conflict management, and further conflict. Lastly, Mr. President, we believe that the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, including the new agenda for peace, provide us with a forward-looking vision for reinvigorated, inclusive, and effective multilateralism to tackle contemporary global challenges. The initiative can lay the grounds for effective multilateralism if they prioritize investment in intervention aimed at addressing existing and emerging risks, including those associated with nuclear weapons and the disproportionate threats to the countries in the global south. Furthermore, enhancing the convening power of the UN in tackling the multifaceted crises, including climate threats, gender inequality in all its forms, and involving women and youth in peace processes are all germane to strengthen the responsiveness of the multilateral system. In conclusion, Mr. President, Ghana believes that the tools available in the UN Charter remain indispensable in addressing existing and emerging challenges of our time. What is required is to strategically harness and effectively deploy these tools, including Chapter 6 of the Peaceful Settlement of Disputes. Ultimately, the demonstration of stronger political will by all member states, including this Council, is essential if we are to make meaningful progress in the defense of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Momba, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his statement. I wish first and foremost to convey our concerns in the light of the violence which is currently raging in Sudan, which has unacceptably been affecting the civilian population. Switzerland joins the call of the Secretary General. The adoption of the Charter of the United Nations on 26 June 1945 signified a fundamental paradigm shift. War, once a legitimate means of a foreign policy, was now prohibited. Territorial expansion by force, previously the privilege of the great military powers, was outlawed. The prohibition of the use of force, coupled with the obligation to resolve conflicts peacefully, was revolutionary. These principles placed countries of all sizes and of all powers on an equal legal footing, or almost. The privileges of the great powers were intensely debated already in San Francisco and finally accepted on condition of a clear promise: greater responsibility for the permanent members of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. As member states, we have all subscribed to the principles and values enshrined in the Charter, and we have reaffirmed this commitment in an excellent declaration on this occasion of the United Nations 75th anniversary. Yet the Charter is being violated on a massive scale. State sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force continue to be flouted, and this has been the case for more than a year by the military aggression of a permanent member of the Security Council against its neighbor. The most effective way to safeguard multilateralism and the integrity of the United Nations Charter is therefore to respect it. Switzerland emphatically condemns the military aggression against Ukraine, and we reiterate our firm call on the Russian Federation to, without delay, withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. This open debate is presented as an opportunity for the Security Council to demonstrate its commitment to the Charter and to discuss the strengthening of multilateralism. This is a duty that we have, not just today, but a duty which we shoulder each time we call for the protection of civilians, every time we condemn violations of international law, and every time we urge the parties to conflict to silence their weapons and to return to the negotiating table. This is a duty we have under the Geneva Conventions, a success of multilateralism, because the Geneva Conventions are among the few international treaties that have been universally ratified. As the conventions commemorate as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the conventions next year, it is incumbent upon states to take concrete steps to strengthen respect for international humanitarian law. This is a duty in times of peace as well as in times of war, to respect human rights that serve to protect human dignity. The 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year will be an opportunity to reaffirm its universality. Switzerland firmly believes that effective multilateralism remains the only way to achieve the vision of a peaceful and just world, a world where the rule of law prevails and not the law of the strongest, a world where human dignity is always respected, a world in which finally the entire population benefits from both social and economic progress. We are convinced of this because respect for the Charter remains existential for a small or medium-sized state like ours, as well as for most member states of the United Nations, regardless of whether this world is unipolar bipolar or multipolar. We are also convinced of this because the Charter and multilateralism have enabled humanity to make remarkable progress, such as avoiding, to this day, a nuclear confrontation, decolonizing many regions of the world, reducing poverty, improving access to health and education systems, making economic progress, and even walking on the moon and creating artificial intelligence. We have managed in this forum to negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, which, if we finally implement them in full, can save this planet and create more equality for both our children and our grandchildren. It is clear that the effectiveness of the Charter hinges on the willingness of states to implement it. And this will is too often lacking. We are living in a world of myriad crises. The United Nations estimates that 1 in every 4 young people is affected by violence or armed conflict, whether she is a girl under the airstrikes in Khartoum, Bakhmut, or Sagaing, sexually abused in Port-au-Prince or Goma, or deprived of education in Kandahar. The principles of the Charter are not a menu from which to pick and choose. We call for unconditional respect for international law by all actors under all circumstances, and we call for the courage to finally and meaningfully initiate reforms of the multilateral system, including the Security Council. This is necessary to restore confidence and trust in and within that system. With our common agenda and a new agenda for peace, we have a unique opportunity, but also an urgent need. We must change the course of history quickly. With leadership, political will, and trust, we can achieve this. History will judge whether we have lived up to the Charter. One can deny facts, one can leverage cynical rhetoric, one can spread misinformation, but one cannot deceive the memory of history. It will be there for judgment, and the human family cannot heal until justice is delivered for victims, until trust is restored. This is the very first recommendation of the High-Level Advisory Board's report on effective multilateralism, rebuilding trust through inclusion and accountability. This trust requires that we listen to one another. Let us initiate a dialogue about what unites us, a constructive dialogue rather than discussions about the number of centers in this world, a dialogue that reminds us of the universal principles to which we have committed ourselves. There is no alternative to effective multilateralism, universal, inclusive multilateralism based on international law. Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Russian Federation for organizing this debate, and I thank the Secretary General for his intervention. Mr. President, in these challenging times, we should reinforce our commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and to multilateralism. As members of the Security Council, we have a particular responsibility in preserving the principles and values based on which the multilateral system has been collectively built over nearly 8 decades. The conflict in Ukraine has added enormous stress to the multilateral system, which was already subject to new challenges and growing dissent. The failure of this Council to effectively deal with yet another war falls short of member states' expectations on its primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and eventually ends up eroding its credibility. The international community has already proven to be able to adapt and evolve in several areas, except in peace and security. For example, back in 2008, after the global financial crisis, a group of countries decided to establish the G20, which proved to be a valuable framework for addressing new economic and financial challenges. Besides its deficiencies, such as a limited representation of African countries, it has since come to be one of the most representative bodies in the international community. The Brazilian position on the Council on Reform is known to all. We believe that its current composition, which reflects the balance of power in 1945, is not compatible with the current geopolitical realities. The African continent and our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, are not represented in the category of permanent members. This results in the increasing lack of legitimacy of this body to take decisions on the peace and security agenda and underscores the sense of frustration which the shortcomings of the UN system as a whole. Mr. President, this is not, however, the only cause of the situation in which we find ourselves. In addition to structural flaws of this Council, we cannot help but notice a lesser disposition to engage in dialogue and diplomacy in contradiction with the spirit of the San Francisco Conference. Since the beginning of our current mandate as an elected member of the Council, there have been many occasions when the demand for sanctions has been the knee-jerk reaction to crisis situations. In most cases, these initiatives were preceded by unilateral coercive measures, illegal under international law, and ineffective. In our discussions, due consideration is rarely given to the spin-off effects on third countries, especially those which already face strong economic, social, and institutional challenges and their most vulnerable populations. Brazil rejects the pursuit of hegemonies, old or new. In line with Article 2, Para 4 of the Charter, we condemn the threat or use of force as means of resolving disputes, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine. We also condemn more subtle attempts to impose the will of the few on the many, on the basis of concepts of dubious multilateral standing. We refute world conceptions based on simplistic divisions that fail to reflect the complexity of reality, an approach that does not benefit the vast majority of member states and only serves to sow division among nations. We defend, in fact, a return to the principles on which this organization bases its very existence, enshrined in the UN Charter, with increased emphasis on peaceful means to end conflicts. As a founding member of this organization, we have never and will never condone violations of member states' territorial integrity. We should not give up on diplomacy and should rather seek solutions collectively to address the challenges of our times. Diplomacy and peace are the means and the purpose of the Security Council. We must not shy away from this responsibility. Mr. President, the world is going through a moment of international order redesign. In our view, we are heading to some sort of multipolar order that should be welcomed and nurtured, since it will benefit the whole of the international community. We are aware of the many shortcomings of the UN system, but we continue to trust the centrality of the United Nations and its role in preserving peace and finding solutions to common challenges. Brazil believes in the strength of the multilateral approach on issues such as climate emergency and on development needs, respecting the diversity of points of view and national positions. It is essential, however, that we engage in an earnest debate about the need for a renewed multilateralism, in particular in the field of peace and security, setting aside practices that will only deepen divisions instead of contributing to a more peaceful world. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to reiterate our hearty congratulations to Russia's assumption of the presidency of the Security Council. We are delighted to see you presiding over this session. We warmly welcome the initiative by the Russian Federation of convening this open debate under the theme. We express our gratitude to the Secretary General of the United Nations for his important briefing. Mr. President, it is universally recognized that the creation of the United Nations represented a new departure in the human attitude towards mutual cooperation for peace and security. The Charter, signed on 26 June 1945, in the aftermath of the bloody and tragic Second World War, clearly affirmed the importance of multilateralism. It proclaimed unambiguously in the treaty the will and determination of we, the peoples of the United Nations. Furthermore, in laying out the purpose of the organization, the Charter listed 4, but the last one summed them all and was framed as follows, and I quote, "To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common goals." This was, in our view, the birth of a new multilateralism that guides the modern-day interaction between states and nations. And it is our conviction that the overriding purpose of this multilateralism is to fulfill the purposes of the United Nations, chief among them the maintenance of international peace and security. This resembles very much what someone someday said: war appears to be as old as mankind, but peace is a modern invention. As a matter of fact, it also resonates with Article 2, Paragraph 4 of our Charter. This is a new approach to war in its nature, an invention of the Charter that we accepted to abide by. It is our understanding that within this provision of the Charter, the founding mission of the United Nations was to provide all its member states with a solid ground of equal security. Our organization would thus become a forum where we could work together to resolve disputes peacefully and to prevent the outbreak of another world war. In sum, the Charter proclaimed the overriding importance of collective security. In this context, equal and indivisible security of states is at the core of collective security that the Charter consecrated in its letter and spirit. The collective security means that the security of one is the security of all, and that the security in our globalized world is also a global concept, a global good that cannot be divided or fragmented. This is why, in our view, Article 51 of the Charter on individual or collective self-defense comes as an exception and a reminder that all states deserve to live in peace and security. In this connection, it is our view that the relations among nations should be based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. As the most representative intergovernmental organization and the utmost expression of multilateralism, the United Nations is the main forum to address multifaceted and complex global challenges through collective action. So any profound divisions among member states can only undermine this important endeavor which the founders of the United Nations undertook to advance in 1945. In this regard, multilateralism, differently and opposed from unilateralism, implies adherence to common principles and objectives founded on respect for a system of shared norms and values and guided by the principles of consultation, inclusion, and solidarity among nations. Mr. President, the current global security challenges, such as interstate wars, interstate conflicts, terrorism, transnational organized crime, proliferation of weapons, limited peacekeeping capacity and financing, divided and competing collective security systems, nuclear disarmament, among others, need a concerted approach with a reinforced role of multilateralism. Divisions in our approach to collective security architecture and mistrust can only undermine dialogue. They hamper our efforts for peaceful settlement of disputes and conflicts. They further weaken the collective resolve of our universal organization to effectively perform its objectives. As Mozambique has stated in this chamber, time and again, peace is a global good. Its preservation requires our concerted efforts. With the positive cooperation of states, we can find concerted and harmonized ways to address most of the current and pressing conflicts around the world, including in Africa, Middle East, Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and even in Europe or beyond. Let us not forget the tragedies of the two world wars that claimed the lives of more than 9 million people in the first and more than 60 million people in the second. We see no reason whatsoever that this should be repeated. But all that we evoked above also bears testimony to the fact that the United Nations, especially the Security Council, must be reformed in order to be more inclusive, effective, just, fair, and democratic. Only in that manner can we collectively address the current geopolitical and security challenges facing the humankind. More importantly, it is a simple corollary of the fundamental principle of sovereign equality of states that the Charter so clearly expounds. We value democracy at national level. It must also be valid at the international level. Therefore, Mozambique reiterates its call on the need for a Security Council reform which should take into account the African common position based on the Zuluin consensus and the Sirte Declaration. In addition, this council has to improve its working methods. It must enhance its capacity to deliver in the interests of all humankind. This means adopting actions that can bring positive change and promote peace and security around the world. In conclusion, Mr. President, we wish to reiterate that in order for multilateralism to prosper and be more effective, the United Nations and the entire membership must abide by and uphold the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter at all times. Multilateralism must be reinvigorated in the interests of the entire humankind in order to address today's global challenges. Multilateralism is at the core of our Charter's calling. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Let me start by thanking Secretary General Guterres for your remarks, and to thank you and the entire UN system for all of your efforts to promote peace and security and to support the UN Charter. And thank you, colleagues, for coming together to talk about how we can defend the UN Charter and make multilateralism more effective. This is a serious topic, even if it was convened by a council member whose actions demonstrate a blatant disregard for the UN Charter. At the United Nations, if you ask a difficult policy question, you get 193 different answers. That makes our work challenging, but it is also right, because after all, that is what the UN is all about. Member states can work through disagreements, find common ground, and see where we can make progress together. And there are some things we're not meant to disagree about. There are some values and principles that are so fundamental, so critical to our purpose, that signing on to them is the price of admission to the UN. These are the values laid out in the United Nations Charter, a charter we have all sworn to uphold and to protect. And it is quite clear what those values are. This little blue book is written in plain language, and it spells out our purposes and principles in its very first chapter. And I want to read it to you. Article 1, the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems, and promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. And here in Article 2, it states clearly, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Territorial integrity, respect for human rights, international cooperation. These are our values. These are the shared, stated principles we all agree to uphold, all of us. And it's our belief in them that binds us together. Those principles have been the basis for the UN's greatest triumphs over the past 8 decades. Despite the international system's imperfections, our shared principles have helped us curtail nuclear proliferation, prevent mass atrocities, and forge peace through negotiation and mediation. They have undergirded an international order that has helped us provide humanitarian aid to those in desperate need, to lift over 1 billion people out of poverty, and to prevent another world war. And right now, as much as ever, the world needs an effective UN and effective multilateralism. Challenges like the climate crisis, the global food security crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic are exactly the kinds of borderless challenges we need the UN to tackle. And yet, right when the world needed the UN most, we were plunged into a crisis of confidence. Our hypocritical convener today, Russia, invaded its neighbor, Ukraine, and struck at the heart of the UN Charter and all the values we hold dear. This illegal, unprovoked, and unnecessary war runs directly counter to our most shared principles, that a war of aggression and territorial conquest is never, ever acceptable. And as we sit here, that aggression continues. As we sit here, Russian forces continue to kill and injure civilians. As we sit here, Russian forces are destroying Ukraine's critical infrastructure. As we sit here, we brace ourselves for the next Bucha, the next Mariupol, the next Kherson, the next war crime, the next unconscionable atrocity. 141 UN member states have made it abundantly clear Russia's full-scale invasion was not about self-defense. Russia simply wants to redraw international borders by force in violation of this very UN Charter. And that goes against everything this institution stands for. This does not just concern Ukraine or Europe. It concerns all of us, because today it's Ukraine, but tomorrow it could be another country, another small nation that is invaded by its larger neighbor. And what would we want this council to do in response? Sit on our hands? No. It is the very reason the UN Charter was written in the first place. And unfortunately, Russia has shown us consistently over the past 14 months that this invasion is not an isolated incident. In the past 14 months, Russia has weaponized global food supplies and obstructed the Black Sea grain initiatives from achieving its full potential. Russia has breached its obligations under the New START Treaty and issued dangerous and provocative nuclear threats. Russia has violated universal human rights and fundamental freedoms both outside and inside its own borders. It has violated international law. That includes the wrongful detention of American citizens. Paul Whelan, Trevor Reed, Brittany Griner, and now Evan Gershkovich. Trevor and Brittany are now thankfully home, safe and sound. But Russia has imprisoned Paul Whelan and now detaining Evan Gershkovich, to use as political bargaining chips, human pawns. Paul was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Evan is a journalist. He was just doing his job. Using people as pawns is a strategy of weakness. These are not the actions of a responsible country. And while Russia plays political games, real people suffer. And I want to direct your attention to the gallery, where today we're joined by Paul's sister, Elizabeth. And I want Minister Lavrov to look into her eyes and see her suffering. I want you to see what it's like to miss your brother for 4 years, to know he is locked up in a Russian penal colony simply because you want to use him for your own means. I'm calling on you right now to release Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich immediately, to let Paul and Evan come home, and to cease this barbaric practice once and for all. Colleagues, while Russia may be undermining the UN Charter and this institution, the rest of us can and must do better. The UN needs reform, you've heard that. To support and maintain its fundamental principles, this body must evolve to meet the 21st century. As part of that evolution, the Security Council needs to better reflect today's global realities. We must find credible, sensible, and politically viable paths to this end. And while we work to forge those paths, those of us on the Security Council have a duty to do more, to do better. As you all know, in San Francisco last year, I announced 6 principles for responsible behavior for Security Council permanent members. These were standards we set for ourselves, that we welcome all to hold us to, that we encourage for other permanent members. Colleagues, the United States believes in the United Nations, and we believe in this charter. And that belief gives us faith that it can be made better still. Our response to Russia's flagrant violations cannot be to abandon this institution's founding principles. Instead, we must recommit to the principles of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of peace and security, and use those principles as guideposts as we strengthen the United Nations and make it fit for the purposes of the 21st century. We must reform this institution and support efforts such as the Secretary General's ambitious Our Common Agenda initiative to modernize the multilateral system. We must not shirk our responsibilities to address threats by the DPRK to international peace and security. We must forcefully address the situation in Sudan as we heard the call from the Secretary General for peace and a cessation of hostilities. We must use our platform to call out aggression and human rights violations wherever and whenever we see them. We must renew our commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to heal the climate, to end poverty and hunger. That is the brighter future we hope to build. So we must rally behind this UN Charter, take on shared global challenges seriously, do everything in our power to be better neighbors, and together create a more peaceful, more prosperous world for us all. Thank you.
As a courteous president, I cannot but thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. At the outset, let me echo the strong concerns set out by the Secretary General about the situation in Sudan and the call for an immediate end to the violence. We have requested a council meeting to address the situation tomorrow. I join others in thanking the Secretary General for his briefing. Minister Lavrov has called this meeting to share the Russian vision for the future of multilateralism. We've seen what Russia's idea of multilateralism means for the world. More than a year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, President Putin has brought unimaginable suffering to that country while trampling on the UN Charter. Thousands of Ukrainians have been killed. Millions have been displaced. And across the world, billions have faced rocketing commodity prices and food insecurity. It's been an unmitigated disaster for Russia too. Neither Russia nor its neighbors feel safer. Trust in Russia's promises to other states and to its own people is at a catastrophic low. Again and again, the UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's invasion. President Putin can count the supporters of his war on one hand. Russia has severely damaged its reputation in the international community. And now, President Putin is threatening to move nuclear weapons into a neighboring state. For Russians, the world is getting smaller. Many tens of thousands of Russian men and women have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been mobilized against their will. Millions are fleeing the country to escape the draft. Independent journalists have been arrested. Free speech has been crushed. Russia's economy is shrinking. Its army is in disarray, reliant on Wagner, an unaccountable mercenary group whose existence was denied a year ago, but who now offers your foreign ministry advice on your Security Council presidency. A Russian generation has lost its future, and the Russian government can't even explain why. Russia's justifications for the war, defeating Nazis and defending against bioweapons, are obvious falsehoods. Russia's claims to Ukraine's territory will never be recognized. For all of Minister Lavrov's claims about effective multilateralism, I see nothing effective or multilateral about Russia's foreign policy. Multilateral institutions can and should evolve, the Security Council included, and the UK supports reforms to make it more effective and representative. Change must be underpinned by respect for the basic principles of the Charter, above all, the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The world also needs a free and safe Ukraine that can return to supplying the world with food. The UK will continue to stand together with Ukraine as it lawfully defends itself. Foreign Minister Lavrov claims he is as interested in ending the conflict as soon as possible. To do so, Russia must immediately remove its troops from all Ukrainian territory. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I invite the representative of the People's Republic of China to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm honored to speak as the representative of Mr. Qin Gang, State Councilor and Foreign Minister of China. China thanks Russia as President of the Security Council for this month for its initiative to convene this open debate and welcomes Foreign Minister Lavrov's presiding over this meeting. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. I also agree with his assessment on the current challenges we are facing. The world is standing at a historic crossroads now. The humanity is facing unprecedented global challenges. Acts of hegemony and bully are causing colossal harm to the world. Bloc politics are creating huge divisions and confrontations. It has become all the more urgent and important to uphold the UN Charter. What is most needed now is for all countries to practice genuine multilateralism, strengthen unity under the banner of the United Nations, enhance the effectiveness of the global governance system, achieve common security, promote common development, and open up a common future. First, the authority of the UN Charter must be firmly safeguarded. The UN Charter is the cornerstone of the post-war international order. The principles of respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference of internal affairs of other countries as stipulated in the Charter have become the basic norms governing modern international relations. The problems that have arisen in the world today are not because the UN Charter has become obsolete, but because its purposes and principles have not been effectively implemented. The security and well-being of present and future generations of mankind still depend on the continued promotion of the spirit of the Charter and on the preservation of the status and role of the United Nations. To safeguard the authority and effectiveness of the Charter, we should not just do it in words, but also in deeds. We must not just have others do it, but start with oneself. We must not be half-hearted and do it selectively, but do it all the time consistently. We must not have exclusive clubby circles, fabricate so-called democracy, confrontation, and authoritarian narratives, and provoke geopolitical confrontation, but advocate dialogue and cooperation, and insist on extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, and resolve disputes by peaceful means. Second, we must firmly uphold the international order underpinned by international law. The world has only one order, and that is the international order underpinned by international law. Faced with the big change and chaos in the world today, we must always be guided by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and base ourselves on international law in handling international affairs. This was an important guarantee for upholding fairness and justice, addressing global challenges, and safeguarding the sovereignty, security, and development interests of all countries. We oppose some countries distorting the meaning of international law, imposing its own will on the international community, packaging it into the so-called rules-based international order, and wantonly violating the legitimate rights of other countries in violation of rule of law, international rule of law. We also oppose the belittling of international agreements, whether it is arbitrarily tearing them up or having double standards. There is no credibility to speak of in this regard. If a major power arbitrarily turns important treaties and agreements that bear on international peace and security into a dead letter, then not only will international law be eroded, but the world will have no peace at all. In this regard, the relevant country should earnestly reflect its action. Third, it is necessary to ensure equal participation of all countries in international affairs. The international system, with the UN at its core, carries the common expectations of the world's peoples and should serve the interests of all countries. The United Nations cannot and should not serve the interests of only some countries or even a few countries. It is unreasonable for citizens of one country to head some specialized UN agencies and international financial institutions on a long-term or even permanent basis. The big change of the world is accelerating. The multipolar world is becoming a reality. The pace of democracy in international relations must also keep up to truly reflect equality and enhance the equity and effectiveness of multilateralism. Developing countries, and African countries in particular, deserve to play a greater role in the United Nations. The right of developing countries to participation and decision-making must be ensured. We support the initiative of Secretary General Guterres to reform the international financial institutions, and we must act immediately to improve the global governance system. Fourth, unilateral sanctions that violate international law must be resisted. Unilateral sanctions indiscriminately imposed by the United States and other countries outside the Council mandate are entirely for maintaining their hegemony, technological monopoly, and ideology. Their practice has no legal basis. This stands in sharp contrast to the development and progress of the world. Unilateral sanctions are like a rampaging monster, constantly creating and aggravating humanitarian crisis, violating the basic rights of women and children, hindering the development and progress of countries, especially small and medium-sized countries, and causing immense damage to the harmony and stability of international relations. What is of greater concern is that unilateral sanctions, often in the name of upholding international law and implementing Council resolutions, have subjected the United Nations to unfounded accusations and weakened its authority for multilateralism. We once again urge the relevant countries to immediately stop unilateral sanctions and call on the international community and all countries to uphold fairness and justice and independence and jointly resist and counteract such illegal acts. Mr. President, as a permanent member of the Security Council and a responsible large country, China adheres to genuine multilateralism all the time. In complying with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and in complying with international law and basic norms governing international relations, China has the best record. President Xi Jinping's concept of building a community with a shared future for mankind represents a fundamental direction for resolving key challenges and difficulties of the world today. China will vigorously promote and implement the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative, comprehensively promote Chinese modernization, participate in the work of the United Nations on all fronts, and make our contribution to the promotion of international solidarity and cooperation in jointly addressing challenges and in safeguarding the common values of mankind. In the face of a world with intertwined change and turmoil, China will move firmly in the right direction. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the People's Republic of China, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to make this clear. Multilateralism is at the very heart of the United Nations. There may be different views on multilateralism, but I hope that this open debate is not intended to divide us rather than unite us. No single member state can solve today's global challenges alone. We need a collective multilateral response. Multilateralism functions only when member states work together based on mutual trust and cooperation, consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is an irony, even a tragedy, that the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, continues its unilateral aggression against Ukraine while hosting an open debate on effective multilateralism through the defense of the principle of the UN Charter on the very International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. The unprovoked ongoing aggression by Russia is nothing but outright defiance of the principle of the UN Charter. The relentless use or threat of use of the veto that has accompanied this aggression has blocked the Security Council from making decisions, paralyzing and discrediting the Council when the world needs it most to fulfill its responsibility. Russia must first and foremost withdraw all its troops and equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders immediately and unconditionally. That has been the repeated demand of the General Assembly, supported by 141 votes, the overwhelming majority of the member states. Let me be clear. Any attempt to unilaterally change a peacefully established status of territories by force or coercion should not be tolerated anywhere in the world. Also, any statement to deny sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, neighboring countries, or any other member state should not be tolerated, especially those by a permanent member of this Council. The concept note of this open debate circulated by Russia does not mention a single word regarding Ukraine, nor the aggression against it, and instead just criticizes many other past crises and invasions. There is no country with a flawless historical record. All of us should squarely face that reality and be humble about it. But having said that, it would be a misuse and politicization of the word multilateralism if it was solely meant to criticize selectively chosen unilateral actions of other countries. Such a narrative, in an attempt to garner support for one's own camp and legitimize one's actions, would only create further division among us and undermine the rule of law and multilateralism itself. Revitalizing and upholding multilateralism is more important than ever. Let us remind ourselves, this is not the first time we have been divided. Every previous time, we found a path to overcome our divisions. So let us go back to the starting point, the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter and the rule of law underpins effective multilateralism in a world of diversity. This is why Foreign Minister Hayashi reiterated his call for uniting for the rule of law in this chamber in January. This is why Japan promotes the rule of law in the Security Council and beyond. International law, including the Charter and the resolutions of the UN, must be respected, abided by, and implemented in good faith by all. The UN should continue to be the bulwark of multilateralism. The Security Council should lead the work, not hamper it. We have to admit, the UN has never been perfect. Nonetheless, we all need the UN at the core of multilateralism. We have to strengthen the function of the UN through reform to better reflect today's reality rather than that of almost 80 years ago, just as reminded by the Secretary General in his briefings. It is long overdue since the world leaders declared in one voice the necessity of an early reform of the Security Council in 2005. We should redouble our efforts to achieve this goal at the earliest. Japan fully supports the Secretary General's initiative in our common agenda and will continue to actively and constructively participate in discussions on the new agenda for peace. I hope that the ambitious recommendations by the High-Level Advisory Board will promote lively discussions among the member states. The future of the United Nations and multilateralism depend upon us, the member states. Let us seize it together. I thank you.
Thank you. I thank the representative of Japan, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, built on the ruins of the Second World War, the international multilateral order, which was as created by the United Nations Charter, is an instrument for the advancement of peace. It is based on such principles as the sovereign equality of states, respect for international law, non-use of force, and peaceful dispute resolution. These principles are currently being flouted and violated. Multilateralism means accepting to comply with the rules which we contributed collectively to drafting and which we all chose to adhere to. For the preservation of international peace and security, we must all respect our shared charter and the collective security system which it has established, which is rooted in respect for law. We recall that use of force, except for legitimate defense, is outlawed. However, for Russia, the rules of law and principles undergirding multilateralism appear to no longer apply. Russia illegally used force in Georgia in 2008, in Crimea, and in Donbass in 2014, and for more than 1 year, this has been the case in Ukraine. Russia has been violating the core principles of international order, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, international humanitarian law by deliberately targeting and systematically targeting civilians, international human rights law by deporting Ukrainian children and engaging in other atrocities, by violating arms embargoes imposed by the Security Council, by procuring drones from Iran to indiscriminately bomb Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, thereby also violating Resolution 2231, which was adopted in 2015 by the Security Council. The General Assembly of the United Nations unequivocally and by an overwhelming majority condemned these violations of our charter. The General Assembly, among other things, called on the Russian Federation to end immediately its aggression and to withdraw its troops. If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, the Russian Federation must respect the rules of international order, and the Russian Federation must cease its violations of the Charter. If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, it must end its war of aggression, which has unleashed dire consequences for both Ukraine and the entire world. If Russia genuinely wishes to defend multilateralism, they must immediately withdraw troops from Ukrainian soil. If the Russian Federation genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, they must initiate in good faith in a quest for peace. If Russia genuinely wishes to uphold multilateralism, then Russia must uphold the rulings delivered by international jurisdictions, such as the International Court of Justice, which explicitly, on 16 March 2022, issued a ruling in the face of other challenges, including security challenges, health challenges, environmental, technological challenges. In the face of these challenges, only collective responses can deliver solutions. We need to address this crisis in Sudan by upholding ambitious, bold multilateralism that protects the interests of peoples and countries as well as shared heritage. Only the strict respect for the principles of international law and greater cooperation can allow us to collectively maintain international peace and security. The law of the strongest protects nobody. We support international institutions and the reform thereof to adapt global governance to reflect present-day challenges. This is the case for Security Council reform. France supports its expansion. Alongside Mexico, we have advanced an initiative proposing that the 5 permanent members collectively and voluntarily refrain from usage of the veto in the case of mass atrocities. We urge all member states to join this initiative, which has already secured the support of 106 members. France has been contributing to the considerations initiated by the Secretary General for the future of our planet and of our populations. We have contributed with the adoption of a new agenda for peace. France has also been fully mobilized for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We remain a leader in terms of global health, for education, countering food insecurity, countering climate change, protection of land and sea biodiversity. Alongside Costa Rica, France will host the United Nations Conference on Oceans in 2025. We will also host in June in Paris a summit to help secure a new global financial compact in a context where the Russian aggression in Ukraine has seriously worsened the situation of the most vulnerable countries and the food insecurity there. France has been advancing gender equality, including through the Women, Peace and Security agenda of the Security Council. We support the initiatives of the Secretary General, and France fully supports the Secretary General's recommendations under our common agenda, which calls for inclusive, effective, efficient multilateralism in order to address the most pressing challenges of humanity. Let us continue to demand respect for our shared rules. Let us continue to act for international peace and security. Let us continue to protect and promote the initiatives that are truly at the heart of an advancement of international security and international law. Thank you. I thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Excellency, and I also thank the Secretary General for sharing his thoughts and insights with us today. Over the years, multilateral institutions with the United Nations at their heart have promoted cooperation and brought prosperity and stability. To make sure that our institutions continue to serve us well, we must recommit to a revitalized multilateral system and uphold the fundamental principles underpinning them, especially at a time when they are being undermined. This is needed to help us address the unprecedented global challenges we are facing. Enhanced cooperation between multilateral organizations at international and regional level with the UN at the core of this work is especially important in the areas of peace and security and sustainable development. Malta is a strong advocate for the integrity, independence and functionality of the UN human rights mechanisms. Human rights are universal and indivisible. A transformational shift in global governance to respond to growing inequalities is also needed. Building equality through multilateralism requires the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women to promote gender transformative actions and agreements. Allow me to make two observations on the concept note circulated ahead of this meeting. First, it is important to highlight that since the creation of the United Nations, the world has been widely guided by the UN Charter and its fundamental principles, among which the principle of sovereign equality of states. It is also worth highlighting that according to the 1970 UN Declaration, there is no conflict between the principles of international law as they are interrelated, and each principle should be constructed in the context of the other principles. In this context, we can never accept the results of last year's illegal referendums engineered by Russia as a pretext for further violation of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We can neither recognize the so-called republics emerging from Russia's illegitimate acts towards Ukraine and their strive for interdependence or strategic autonomy, as indicated in the concept note. On the contrary, such actions contribute to the unraveling of the rules-based order. Second, it is deeply worrying that the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, blatantly disregarded the primary function of the Security Council to maintain international peace and security when it launched its aggression against Ukraine. Neither can we forget that this illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war generated one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War, a global grain shortage, hundreds of thousands killed or injured, forced deportations of children, worldwide anxiety for a nuclear disaster, and negatively impacted the credibility of the Council. On this occasion, we once again urged the Russian Federation to stop this war, withdraw its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and turn to dialogue and diplomacy as the tools which can bring stability to the region. As an elected member of the Security Council, Malta firmly believes in applying in good faith the toolbox for the peaceful settlement of disputes contained in Article 33 of the Charter. In the same vein, there is space for the Security Council to strengthen its cooperation with the ICJ and the ICC. On Security Council reform, Malta is firm in its conviction that the Council needs to reflect today's realities and challenges. To respond to true multilateralism, we underline the need for the Council to also be more inclusive. Malta is a strong supporter of the standing mandate for a General Assembly debate when a veto is cast in the Council. In the same vein, we also fully support the political declaration on suspension of veto powers launched by France and Mexico, as well as the Act Code of Conduct. Finally, Malta unequivocally supports the UN Secretary General's key proposals, traversing our common agenda report. All the current OCA-related negotiations on progressing the work of the organization and enhancing the constructive power of multilateralism, as well as the work of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism established by the UN Secretary General in March 2022. In preparation for the 2023 Sustainable Development Goals Summit, we underscored the need for the international community to take stock of the progress we have achieved so far and the gaps that remain, while engaging in intensive multilateral efforts to bridge the implementation of the SDGs back on track. We also look forward to the September 2024 Summit of the Future to advancing ideas for governance arrangements in areas of global commons. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Mr. President, I wish to begin by thanking the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, for his briefing. I also wish to underscore the value of the focus given to today's debate. This debate complements that organized by India in December of 2022, entitled New Orientations for Reformed Multilateralism. Today's debate also complements the meeting organized by China in May of 2021 on upholding multilateralism and the UN-centered international system. Furthermore, it also complements the debate convened by Vietnam in January 2020 on upholding the UN Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. In other words, year after year, this chamber witnesses states agree on the need to guarantee an effective multilateralism through the defense of the United Nations Charter. The problem is that since January 2020, instead of abating, conflicts have increased in number, and this in spite of the Secretary General's appeal for a global ceasefire. Mr. President, if we're going to talk about multilateralism, well, the time has come to go from words to action, from discourse to deed. Following the tragic events which drove humankind to two global conflagrations, with the United Nations Charter that today we defend, we enshrined the principle of multilateralism. Never again would a nation, however powerful it may be, never again would that nation be able to imperil the peace and security of another nation or of the world as a whole, simply because doing so would suit its own interests or ambitions. The obligation and principle of the peaceful settlement of disputes is a pivotal one. That was reiterated by this very Security Council with the presidential statement issued on the 6th of May 2022 on maintenance of peace and security in Ukraine. In only 2 weeks, we will mark the first anniversary of that statement. It has yet to be implemented. Another central principle of the United Nations Charter, and one that is sacred to states, is the inviolability of territorial integrity. As such, we can say that today's debate will have been utterly pointless if, once it closes, there is not one less conflict, one less war, or one less invasion. Mr. President, what better result could this debate have than a decision on the part of your country to put an end to its military aggression against Ukraine in accordance with the decision handed down by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March 2022? What better legacy could there be of your presidency than if your government chose to return to the path of peace and to withdraw its occupying troops? None of the pretexts invoked to attack Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter has legal merit. Not one of them. In this chamber, we've been told, for example, that the invasion of Ukraine is a response to a supposed phobia that exists of Russian culture. We've been told that this invasion is a response to a supposed Western conspiracy to weaken Russia. We've been told that Russia is acting in self-defense in response to anti-Russian policies imposed by Ukraine on certain inhabitants. None of these arguments have any grounding in the UN Charter. It goes without saying. We must remember that the Charter is one, indivisible and universal. Mr. President, there is not a United Nations Charter for the West, another for the East, another for the North, and another for the South. There is not a United Nations Charter for Muslims, another for Christians, and another for Jews. We also can't talk about a charter for Africa, another for Europe, or another for America, and so on. No, Mr. President, the charter is, I repeat, one charter. It is indivisible and universal. How could we neglect to recognize Russia's vast contribution, including that made by its major cultural torchbearers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, or Pasternak? But is there any way we could imagine for even a minute that those cultural envoys would be in agreement with the death and pain that this absurd war is inflicting upon millions of people? The concept note of this debate asks the question, how can the United Nations contribute to a smooth transition to a fair and equitable global order? I can assure you that war and violence will in no way lead us to a fairer and more equitable order. Quite on the contrary. Ladies and gentlemen, global military expenditure exceeded $2 trillion in 2022. That alone undermines the primary objectives of multilateralism and the goals of this organization: peace, security, sustainable development, and human rights. Worse still is the fact that we need to again recall that nuclear weapons have no place in a law-based international order. They defy the existence of humankind. Consequently, we cannot talk about effective multilateralism if we do not move towards effective arms control and disarmament. Even Article 26 of the UN Charter itself refers to the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources. Let us silence the guns and honor the promise of peace that we made in San Francisco. Let us honor our commitment to living side by side as good neighbors. What more fearsome enemy is there to multilateralism than treating the world as a risk board or any board game? That was the world view of the colonial powers of the 19th century, the world view of the fascist and Nazi regimes of the 20th century, regimes that invaded and annexed other nations, subjugating them by force, and at times using shameful referenda to lend a veneer of legality to their actions. This practice is not only now incompatible with the United Nations Charter, it is also ethically unacceptable. Ecuador cannot remain silent in the face of this situation. As such, we are resolute in supporting Security Council reform and the establishment of a new agenda for peace. But let us make no mistake, any institutional framework, however modern it may be, any planning tool, however strategic and updated it is, will be nothing more than an empty shell if They do not go hand in hand with a behavior change on the part of states. In this regard, the permanent members of the Security Council have the obligation to demonstrate responsible leadership, leadership which understands and respects the principle res communis omnium. According to this principle, the commons cannot be appropriated by one individual because the commons are there for the common benefit of the international community. As was stated by Boutros Ghali, only one power can impose order on chaos. That is the power of the principles which move beyond changing opinions about what is most suitable in the short term. To conclude, I must recall that multilateralism is not an end in itself, but rather a means. However, it is something upon which women and girls in Haiti, Colombia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, or Somalia depend. We all depend on it. And indeed, all of our nations depend on it. Let us defend the UN Charter. Let us do so by practicing restraint and tolerance, by keeping and building peace. As was reminded by the Secretary-General in his report on our common agenda, peace is a global public good that we must protect and manage. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking the SG for his remarks and pay tribute to his tireless efforts, to his clear, strong, and always principled position in favor of peace and security and of multilateralism in respect of the UN Charter. Colleagues, 400 years ago, François de la Rochefoucauld has said, and I quote, "Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to the virtue." Fast forward to this meeting, and there is a flagrant contradiction we find ourselves in today. A permanent member of the Security Council has openly and defiantly disregarded the UN Charter. That very country has knowingly and willingly transgressed every rule commonly established regarding relations between states. It has ignored Security Council resolutions and its own international commitments, and yet it has chosen to lecture the world about multilateralism as we heard today. I could go on with generalities or repeat many important aspects mentioned by colleagues around the table, but I prefer to recall the very simple facts. Russia is waging an unjustified and illegal war of aggression against a sovereign nation. It is questioning its right to exist and has the audacity to pretend to come to the rescue of sovereign equality. The Russian military, including the Wagner Group, are committing horrible crimes in Ukraine as documented by the UN, and Russia is pretending to defend universal values. Russian missiles are destroying residential areas, killing civilians, flattening schools, health facilities, and other civilian infrastructure to force an entire country into submission. And Russia has come here to share its views about friendly relations and cooperation among states. If it weren't for the thousands of innocent victims, the millions forcefully displaced, for the countless children stripped of their dreams and deprived of their childhood, for the immense pain of those tortured, of women raped and families torn apart, it would have been a parody, something the Monty Python would have entitled "Preserving the UN Charter the Russian Style, Shred It and Store It 6 feet under." Unfortunately, this isn't a parody and we cannot laugh. What has happened in Ukraine is a tragedy, a man-made catastrophe with serious security repercussions in Europe and detrimental ripple effects around the world. It represents the contrary of everything we stand for and everything that gets us together here. Therefore, no peace-loving nation will buy an artificial parallel reality engineered to transform the aggressor into a defender of the UN Charter, the arsonist into a firefighter, and the warmonger into a peacemaker. This is the real issue, and this is what we think we should be talking about, especially on this day. Colleagues, the ongoing war in Ukraine and the current global reality pose the fundamental question of multilateralism, its future and our ability to defend it. Almost 8 decades have clearly shown that multilateralism has been and remains indispensable to promoting peace and stability, uphold the rule of law, promote and protect human rights. Today, we need multilateralism more than ever because we know that global challenges require global solutions, that we can achieve more by working together rather than by pursuing our interests individually. No country alone, whatever its size and wealth, will be able to deal successfully with climate change, transnational terrorism, or future pandemics. This requires a genuine commitment to international cooperation, diplomacy, and compromise, and the firm recognition that no country can achieve its goals at the expense of the others. This requires defending and standing by what we have agreed, respecting international commitments and denouncing those who abuse and deform its spirit under the disguise of defending it. Colleagues, the UN needs reform to strengthen it, make it more efficient, more resultative, not to undo it. We do not want a world fueled by resuscitated imperial appetites, a world fragmented by new rivalries instead of one united in purpose. The number of poles will be meaningless and ridiculous if we fail to address the fundamental challenges posed by climate change and environmental deterioration. The UN General Assembly has confirmed several times that it will not accept a future where might dictates the right, that it will not be trolled by cynical semantics where an aggression is labeled special operation and crimes are disguised as special care. Yes, let's call a spade, since hypocrisy is nothing more than the audacity to preach integrity through depravity. And unfortunately, there was a ton of it from Russia today in a toxic mixture of everything that fits its propaganda. In particular, it has become a Russian obsession to refer to the Republic of Kosovo, a country recognized by more than half of the UN, to justify its unlawful actions in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine since 2014, which, as we all know, is going on to this hour. The International Court of Justice has ruled that the independence of Kosovo is in accordance with international law. The same ICJ has asked for Russia to stop its war. Therefore, there is nothing that sounds hollower than the desperate effort to justify the unjustifiable and its attempt to hide behind the unacceptable. As we know, you cannot hide the sun with the finger, and today, once more, we did not hear anything on the key issue. Under which article of the UN Charter has Russia attacked its neighbor and has annexed by force parts of its territory? Colleagues, if we want to maintain the UN as the cornerstone of the multilateral world, we need to show respect for each other, not contempt. We need to show solidarity, not threats. We need to show diplomacy, to choose diplomacy and foster dialogue, not wage war. We need to work together, abide by our commitments, and we need justice through accountability for crimes committed and for the perpetrators to be held to account. In today's terms of urgency, this means that Russia must end its war, withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and respect its sovereignty and its territorial integrity within the internationally recognized borders. And I thank you.
I thank Albania, and I now give the floor to those members of the organization who wish to take the floor during today's open debate. And the first to take the floor, I give is a representative of Mr. Gerardo Peñavel Portal, the First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Mr. President, we endorse the statements made that will rather shortly be made by the chair of the Coordinating Bureau of the Non-Aligned Movement, the representative of Azerbaijan. We also align ourselves with the statement to be made by Venezuela on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. We welcome here among us today the presence of the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation as President of the Security Council. We also recognize the Deputy Minister. We welcome the convening of this open debate as we mark the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. This was an initiative promoted within the General Assembly of the United Nations by the sister Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela when it held the chairmanship of the non-aligned movement between 2016 and 2019. Mr. President, in the currently complex landscape marked by an escalation of tensions and new forms of domination and hegemony, we are seeing threats to international peace and security grow, and we're seeing the gradual weakening of multilateralism. The global, multidimensional crisis that we're currently witnessing has been rendered more acute by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is dealing a heavier blow to the countries of the South, and this is a result of the unjust and unsustainable prevailing international order. We've seen inequalities worsen, social marginalization heighten, and poverty grow more severe. Wars are abounding, non-conventional wars are intensifying, and we're seeing the arms race continue at breakneck speed. Attempts have been made to reimpose a unipolar order. This is being done by nations showing blatant disregard for international treaties and by their increasing the application of unilateral coercive measures. And these join other frequent violations of the United Nations Charter and international law. These violations undermine the peaceful coexistence of nations. In the face of this grave reality, we reaffirm the need to pool efforts to strengthen multilateralism, international cooperation, and solidarity to tackle common challenges. There is an urgent need to usher in wholesale transformations of the United Nations organization in such a way as to allow us to move towards an international democratic order which is just, equitable, and which respects the sovereign equality of states, and this for the benefit of present and future generations. We must promote a culture of peace, one which guarantees the security and well-being of our nations. We must revitalize and strengthen the role of the UN General Assembly without there being any interference without the Security Council interfering in its work. There is an overriding need to reform the Security Council and to render it a more transparent, inclusive, democratic and representative body. Mr. President, multilateralism and absolute respect for the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law are the way in which we can guarantee the peaceful coexistence of nations, and the only way that we can guarantee international peace and security, and the only way that we can find lasting solutions to systemic problems. We must immediately see the cessation of unilateral coercive measures and the establishment of spurious and arbitrary lists, such as that of states which supposedly sponsor terrorism. These lists run counter to international law. The world needs solidarity, cooperation, and mutual respect, not blockades, nor sanctions. Cuba will continue to defend staunchly and consistently the Charter of the United Nations and international law. We will remain committed to the tenets of the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. With strict adherence to these principles, we reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism and to the preservation of international peace and security. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gerardo Peña Portal, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. The convening of this debate on effective multilateralism is timely, provided that we tackle this issue in a comprehensive fashion. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his lucid diagnosis of the problems we face. Mexico is convinced of the importance of multilateralism to address the common problems of humankind. However, for this multilateralism to be effective, states absolutely must uphold their obligations with strict respect for the rule of law. It is only in this way that we will be able to deploy the multilateral mechanisms required to avoid a situation where we see the collapse of the international order, or to avoid this order only being restored once it has collapsed. As such, the current challenges jeopardizing the effectiveness of multilateralism are huge. Constant violations of the UN Charter, constant violations of the Security Council's resolutions, and constant violations of the obligations emanating from political commitments and a range of treaties imperil international peace and security within a highly volatile arena. Regarding violations of the Charter, the invasion by one sovereign country of any other constitutes a flagrant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter and constitutes an act of aggression pursuant to Resolution 3314 of the General Assembly. Moreover, we reiterate our concern too at the frequent invocations of self-defense against non-state actors. This is an abusive use of Article 51 of the Charter. Mr. President, we are currently facing the collapse of certain collective security systems on which our organization is built. Indeed, the lion's share of the world order is built on these systems. There is frequent non-compliance with decisions of the Security Council, and this non-compliance doesn't produce any great consequences. That fact undermines the Security Council's authority and its credibility in the eyes of the international community and in the eyes of the UN's peoples. Regarding non-compliance with international treaties, we'll refer to only one example, which has historically been a source of great concern for Mexico. More than 50 years have elapsed since the entry into force of the NPT. In that time, the commitments entered into by nuclear weapon states pursuant to its Article 6 have not been complied with, far from it. Something similar is occurring with political commitments in terms of small arms and light weapons, for example. This is an issue of great interest for many countries, including my own. It is regrettable that we continue to fail to adopt effective measures to prevent, combat and eradicate the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. Some of the primary producers of these weapons allow or tolerate the proliferation or deviation of these weapons, and that is a great catalyst for conflicts around the world. Therefore, effective multilateralism should take measures to contain and reverse situations such as these. Unfortunately, this is difficult to achieve, particularly in terms of peace and international security, when this council is paralyzed by a veto being used by a small number able to halt the international community's action. Multilateral legal bodies continue to have a limited scope. Consequently, we need to achieve the universality of the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. We need to make progress with the acceptance of the ICJ's jurisdiction. Reality is proving to be quite different. After almost 80 years, less than half of the UN member states accept the ICJ's jurisdiction. In conclusion, discussions such as that we're having today are necessary and timely. However, the challenges facing multilateralism greatly limit our organization. Preventive diplomacy and mediation, this has already been said, must be genuine options which go hand in hand with the vital reform of the Security Council if we really do wish to move towards a more effective multilateralism. As such, Mexico tables a proposal for a reform of the Security Council, which is comprehensive. The goal of this proposal is to lend momentum to negotiations underway within the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico, and I wish to remind all distinguished speakers of the request to limit the length of their statements to 4 minutes to ensure that the Security Council can carry out its work expeditiously. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Mr. President, we acknowledge Rashida Presidency for convening this important and timely open debate, and we thank Minister Lavrov and the Secretary General for their insightful views and briefing for reaffirming the significance of multilateralism. Mr. President, multilateralism has been recognized as a well-established approach to addressing global challenges, and effective multilateralism operating within the framework of the UN Charter is essential for ensuring international peace and security. Achieving this requires a strong commitment to upholding international law, promoting transparency and accountability, and adhering to the principles outlined in the UN Charter. The UN Charter establishes a comprehensive framework of principles and norms that member states must adhere to in their relations with one another. These principles include peaceful dispute resolution, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs, the prohibition of the use of force, and the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. By abiding by these principles, member states can promote a stable and secure international legal order that benefit all nations and peoples. In the meantime, multilateralism must ensure the active participation of all nations, regardless of their size, wealth, or political orientation. The exclusion of any country undermines the principle of inclusiveness and may result in biased outcomes. All countries, especially those directly affected by decisions made through multilateral mechanism, should have an equal opportunity to participate, contribute, and to be heard in the decision-making processes. Mr. President, Excellencies, the integrity and effectiveness of multilateralism are undermined by the abuse of UN systems and selective application of international law, as well as the use of unilateralism, which poses a serious threat to international cooperation, peace, and security. Unilateral coercive measures, including their extraterritorial application, represent a concerning example of harmful unilateral acts that run counter to the fundamental principles of international law, the UN Charter, and basic human rights. These illegal measures have far-reaching humanitarian consequences and can undermine diplomatic efforts aimed at resolving dispute and promoting cooperation. Within this context, the United States' unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, reimposition of illegal unilateral sanctions on Iran, is coercion of the other countries to engage in these illegal actions, and defiance of International Court of Justice order are striking examples of how much harmful unilateral acts violate the UN Charter, undermine the UN systems, and threaten the multilateralism. In this recent judgment on 13 March 2023, in the case of concerning certain Iranian assets, the International Court of Justice has declared that the United States has violated its international obligations to the Iranian people by imposing unilateral sanctions that are deemed illegal under international law. The ICJ's ruling is final and binding, requiring the US to comply with this decision. In conclusion, Mr. President, collaboration should be the cornerstone of multilateralism rather than confrontation. Collaborative approach fosters trust, builds consensus, and promotes sustainable solutions to global challenges. Through collaborative problem solving and engagement with all parties, multilateralism can effectively address the challenges facing our world today. In this context, diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiation should be the preferred means for resolving dispute among member states. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I now invite the representative of Egypt to take the floor.
وزير سيرجي لافروف السيد الرئيس أهنئكم على
Mr. Minister, we wish to congratulate you on your presidency of the Security Council this month of April, and we commend you for the choice of the theme for today's meeting. This is a theme which is of paramount importance for Egypt in the light of the challenges which our world has been encountering. It is incumbent upon us to work towards surmounting these challenges which have been affecting developing states, specifically African states. Today, we are discussing reinforcement of effective multilateralism. This needs to be more effective through within the United Nations system. And in this regard, it is incumbent upon us to base ourselves on the principles of the United Nations Charter, which was the founding document for the United Nations. Let us recall a few historic elements. First and foremost, the signing of the Charter in 1945. This was a turning point in the history of humanity. The international community took an informed decision to base international relations on cooperation, on consensus, on justice, on peace, on peaceful coexistence, on collective security, on equality in terms of sovereignty, and on non-interference. Egypt is among the founding nations of the organization. Egypt has also played a key role in the creation of other international organizations and regional organizations, specifically the African Unity Organization, known today as the African Union, as well as the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is now known as the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as well as we have contributed to a number of initiatives of regional groups and coalitions and interregional groups of coalitions such as G77 plus China, as well as the non-aligned movement. 75 years have elapsed since the inception of our organization, and we have observed a number of alarming practices. First and foremost, the setbacks and backsliding in a number of key principles which were at the heart of the creation of our organization. There have been attempts at interference in the internal affairs of states under various fallacious pretexts. Second, the monopolization by certain countries, specifically certain major powers, monopolization of decision-making without consultations with states in the concerned regions, specifically African states. And in this regard, let us recall the evolutions in Africa that have been observed over the past 7 decades. These developments mean that African states' opinions need to be taken on board. Third, there has been double standards and a number of files, and these have affected political relationships as well as links and ties and relationships among other countries. Fourth, attempts by certain states to politicize international fora, and this has undermined the ability of these fora to act. And this has undermined international multilateralism, specifically through international trade as part of development and countering climate change. Fifth, the attempt by some to downplay the role of states by attributing greater importance to the actions of non-state actors. This is particularly alarming. If a number of non-state actors have an opportunity to play a positive role in some files, this does not mean that they can replace states or to engage in or to compete with states. Mr. President, overall reform of the international multilateral system needs to be based on the following. Number one, all states need to be convinced of the need for peaceful coexistence based on justice and equality. To achieve this, there is a need to revert back to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations to counter the various challenges which we currently face. Two, there's a need for reform of global economic governance system within which there are the Bretton Woods institutions. We need this reform in order to surmount the challenges of climate change and food security on the basis of an initiative which was submitted by Egypt during COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and on the basis of the need to reform the multilateral trade system, which presently has been affecting economic development, sustainable economic development. Three, we need to re-examine the collective security system by allowing various regions to play their role and by reforming the Security Council, by correcting the historic injustice for Africa based on the El Swahili consensus as well as the Sirte Declaration. The Security Council also needs to improve its working methods and to enhance coordination and cooperation with regional mechanisms, specifically African mechanisms, to find African solutions to African problems. Mr. President, we have been proactively engaged in dialogue on the future of our organization, and we have been closely following the various proposals submitted by the Secretary General, specifically in the lead-up to the Summit for the Future, as well as through our common agenda and the new agenda for peace. We believe that today's meeting should grant us an opportunity to seize these various opportunities to move forward. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the representative of Egypt, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, first of all, let me say it's a profound pleasure, personally, for me to see you preside over this meeting of the Security Council. The Pakistan delegation also thanks you and the Russian presidency for organizing this important debate on international security and effective multilateralism. We also thank the Secretary General for his important briefing. Mr. President, today, international peace and security confront multiple threats arising from violations of the principles of the UN Charter, great power rivalries, a renewed global arms race, proliferating conflicts and disputes, spreading terrorism, hate and Islamophobia, organized crime, rising poverty, and growing climate impacts. We believe that these multidimensional and global challenges can be overcome only through multilateral cooperation. We reject a unipolar, bipolar, or even a so-called multipolar world if it is dominated by a few large and powerful states. Such an order would be contrary to the principle of sovereign equality of states. We seek effective multilateralism, a multilateral order constructed on the basis of the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, one in which each member state has an equal voice and an equal stake. At the same time, we must express our concern at some new concepts advanced in some of our discussions within the United Nations, such as multi-stakeholder and networked multilateralism. These concepts, too, are contrary to the UN Charter, which envisages an international system composed of equal and sovereign member states. Mr. President, effective multilateralism can address the current and emerging threats to international peace and security. A critical part of this endeavor must be to promote universal and consistent respect for the fundamental principles of the UN Charter by all states, irrespective of their size, power, and influence. To this end, the UN Secretary General should prepare an annual review of situations on the Security Council's agenda where the Charter's principles and its resolutions and the resolutions of the Security Council are being violated or remain unimplemented. The Security Council must take bold decisions to secure the compliance by states with the Charter's principles and its own resolutions and decisions. The Council has various means available to it under the Charter to secure such compliance. The Secretary General has rightly mentioned decolonization as a major achievement of the United Nations. Yet, a prime illustration of the derogation from the Charter and the Security Council's resolutions is the situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where the exercise of the right of self-determination by the Kashmiri people, prescribed by the Security Council, has been subverted and suppressed by India through 7 decades of force and fraud. Another is the situation in occupied Palestine. Protestations of commitments to the UN Charter ring hollow when no action is taken to redress these blatant violations of the UN Charter and resolutions of the Security Council on 2 issues which have remained on the agenda of the Security Council for the last 75 years. Secondly, Mr. President, if the world is to avoid global catastrophe, it is now essential to redress the rising tensions between the major military powers. We hope that a sincere effort will be made to end the war in Ukraine on the basis of the Charter and international agreements. We hope that tensions will not be further provoked in Asia. We are concerned at the expansion of military alliances and the escalation of military expenditures and capabilities. These developments also threaten peace and stability in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Mr. President, the summit of the future next year should reaffirm the solemn commitment, especially by the militarily significant states, to refrain from the use or threat of use of force, respect the UN Charter's principles, implement Security Council resolutions, restrain military expenditures and provocative deployments, and eschew military blocs and alliances. Mr. President, rising global tensions have undermined the entire edifice of arms control and disarmament. An uncontrolled arms race, which now encompasses several new weapons and new domains of competition, will sooner or later lead to a disastrous conflict involving states armed to the teeth with conventional and nuclear weapons. The United Nations can and should take the lead in reviving the process of arms control and disarmament based on the consensus achieved at the 1978 First Special Session on Disarmament, whose central principles were equal security for all states, ensuring national security at the lowest possible level of armaments, and the preservation of military balance and mutual restraint at the global and regional level. We must also outlaw dangerous military doctrines, especially the presumption that conventional wars can be fought between nuclear-armed states without fear of nuclear escalation. Mr. President, the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary-General can do much more to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes through the multiple modalities available under the chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the Charter. The agenda for peace, mentioned by the Secretary-General, must also address the fundamental causes of conflict, including poverty and hunger, foreign occupation and oppression, injustice, human rights violations, and environmental and climate impacts. Mr. President, finally, effective multilateralism can only be built on the foundations of strong international institutions. The Security Council should be enlarged and become more representative, accountable, democratic, transparent, and effective. It should not become an enlarged club of the large and powerful states. However, a reformed Security Council in itself offers no panacea to ensure effective multilateralism. It must be accompanied by fully utilizing the considerable potential of the General Assembly, the activation of the UN's disarmament machinery, and most critically, the reform and democratization of the Bretton Woods institutions. Mr. President, effective multilateralism, in short, must be comprehensive, inclusive, and equitable. Pakistan will work assiduously to promote such effective multilateralism, including in the preparations for the Summit of the Future next year. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan, and I now invite the representative of the Philippines to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Your Excellency Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, for convening today's Security Council open debate on multilateralism. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his briefing. President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. had stated that, and I quote, "Amidst challenging global tides, an important ballast stabilizes our common vessel. That is, our open, inclusive, and rules-based international order that is governed by international law and informed by the principles of equity and of justice." Close quotes. With that in mind, and as a proud founding member of the United Nations, the Philippines reaffirms its commitment to the Charter of the United Nations, its principles, and firm adherence to the rule of law among nations. We reject any attempt to deny or redefine our common understanding of these principles. The landmark 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations among states represents our common understanding of these principles in multilateralism, and international law is a great equalizer. The Philippines, for its part, has exerted utmost efforts to reinforce the predictability and stability of international law in addressing challenges to peace and security. International law provides a strong basis for dialogue and consensus in addressing differences. With the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, we provided an example of how states should resolve their differences through reason and through right. Resorting to peaceful settlement of international disputes through arbitration and credible and competent international tribunals plays a key role in the interpretation of international norms and should not be seen as an unfriendly act among civilized nations. Defending the Charter means adherence to its fundamental principles, compliance with international tribunals, as well as active engagement with the UN processes, including through the Special Committee on the Charter of the United Nations, to ensure constructive outcomes. I take this opportunity to highlight the Manila Declaration, which reaffirms fundamental principles of the UN Charter, among others, the obligation of all states to settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. As an initiative of non-aligned countries, the Manila Declaration remains as relevant as ever as we confront complex interrelated challenges to the rule of law and the UN Charter, including in the context of the new agenda for peace. Fundamental to an effective multilateralism is an inclusive, transparent, reformed, and representative Security Council. A reformed council must be able to respond decisively and swiftly to 21st century challenges and threats to international peace and security. It should highlight improved working methods aimed at greater participation of non-members. It also involves enhanced consultations mechanism between the Security Council and regional groups and subgroups. I conclude by underscoring that for the Philippines, a people-centered multilateralism must thrive as a unifier and as a platform for inclusion and empowerment of nations and their citizens. People-centered multilateralism must be a constant, even as we continue to face global challenges amidst geopolitical tensions and strategic competitions. Multilateralism will be effective if we adhere to the principles that we deeply cherish: non-aggression, non-interference, peaceful coexistence, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and equality and mutual benefit. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Philippines, and I now invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to take the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود بداية
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to welcome His Excellency Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, and his presidency of this very important meeting. Also, I would like to thank the Russian Federation for holding this important meeting that is timely and substantive. First of all, we would like to align ourselves with the statement of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement and the statement of Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter. Mr. President, The United Nations has been, since its inception 80 years ago, the face of multilateralism. The United Nations has directly contributed to peaceful settlement of conflicts, decolonization, peacekeeping and peace building, promoting the efforts towards the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and counter-terrorism. The Charter of the United Nations is very clearly categorized and includes specific benchmarks regarding the mandates of the main bodies, namely the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the other organs established by virtue of the Charter. The Charter also has a number of provisions related to the mechanisms and mandates of all those bodies which are ideally mentioned. Thus, we have to abide by the mandates of those bodies, and those bodies should be discharging their mandates without encroachment on the mandates of other organs and without exceeding their mandate. This also should avoid any chaos or competition amongst those bodies, whether at the level of decision-making or even crisis management and management of international conflicts. The mechanisms and methods of work of the United Nations have significantly affected the development of friendly relations between member states, and those mechanisms have equally been influenced by the rising challenges imposed by the changing reality of international relations. This calls for continuous and comprehensive review of those methods of work and mechanisms in terms of substance and procedures. The main rules of the work of the United Nations is based on multilateralism, especially when it comes to conflict settlement peacefully, as well as the main principles of equality in sovereignty, economic cooperation and development. In order for us to achieve this objective, all member states should abide by the mainstays of the United Nations, namely reflected in its charter, in addition to the provisions of the international law, as well as the established norms of international relations. Meanwhile, we have to avoid using methods or using terminology that are not consensual, especially the term of rules-based system. The development and improvement of the work of the main bodies of the United Nations requires more objectivity and wise planning as regards the items on the agenda of those organs. Recently, the General Assembly has witnessed a remarkable increase in the number of items on its agenda, and there is an unprecedented increase in the number of unconsensual resolutions, and in many cases, a vote is required, notwithstanding the differences on the substance and procedures of those resolutions. The Security Council has also witnessed severe polarization, especially on the part of certain permanent members, by way of confusing priorities in their endeavors to divert the Security Council away from its main mandate, which is the maintenance of international peace and security, in order to serve their own destructive agendas. Mr. President, the multilateral system incarnated by the United Nations has faced during the last 2 decades staggering challenges when addressing a number of political, economic, and social crises. This was manifest in the debacle of preventing the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the inability to put an end to the tragedy of the Palestinian people who languish under the yoke of the Israeli occupation for decades, and addressing the increasing terrorist threats and the outbreak of pandemics and diseases, in addition to exacerbation of humanitarian suffering due to poverty, hunger, and thirst. Preserving real multilateralism requires reforming the current structures, chiefly amongst which expanding the Security Council to be truly representative of the new political reality, and also to reform the international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank in order to address the interests of developing countries, especially the countries of the South. This also requires to actively address any attempts to manipulate the provisions of the Charter or to misinterpret those provisions to justify the interference in the internal affairs of certain member states, or to stoke bloody conflicts and stoke chaos and terrorism, thus making those countries to be left behind. Mr. President, my country, Syria, during the last decade has been victim to the loss of true multilateralism and to the exploitation by certain countries of the United Nations as a platform to serve their hostile and interfering policies in the affairs of Syria. Syria was left alone to face the threats of the most intractable and cruel terrorist groups. Its resources and wealth have been pillaged by certain foreign forces that are illegally present on the territories of Syria, not to mention the exacerbating humanitarian suffering due to unilateral compulsory measures that are totally illegal, inhumane, and immoral that are imposed by the United States and the European Union, and which have adversely affected all the aspects of life and caused millions of displaced persons and refugees. All the foregoing are staggering and egregious violations of the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that today we do need more than any time before to review the methods of work of the United Nations and to guarantee the promotion of true multilateralism based on the Charter by upholding the purposes and principles of the Charter and by achieving the objectives that were aspired to by the founding fathers of the United Nations, together with upholding and promoting the efficiency and efficacy of the United Nations in order to uphold its credibility at the international level. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. There are still speakers inscribed on my list to deliver statements for this meeting. With the consent of member states, I intend to suspend this meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.